Hello, I'm Simon Owens, and you're listening to The Business of Content, a podcast about how publishers create, distribute, and monetize their digital content. For this week's episode, I interviewed the founder behind a business-focused newsletter that grew to over 50,000 subscribers. When Tyler Morin was in high school, he dreamed of going into journalism, but his parents convinced him to major in finance instead. After graduating, he went into the financial sector, but he never lost his ambition to work in media, and he became obsessed with daily newsletters like Morning Brew and theSkimm. After experimenting with a group sports blog, he pivoted to launching a daily newsletter called The Watercoolist. The Watercoolist found an audience and quickly grew to tens of thousands of subscribers. I recently interviewed Tyler about the founding of his company, how he found his first advertisers, and why he decided to launch a paid version. Before we jump into the interview, I want to talk about a case study I recently published. I interviewed Ernie Smith, the creator of a newsletter called Tedium, about how he grew his subscriber base by syndicating his articles to places like Vice, Popular Mechanics, and Atlas Obscura. The strategy was so successful that his subscriber base grew to over 10,000, and he was featured in NPR's Planet Money. There's only one way to access this case study and others like it, and it's by becoming a subscriber to my newsletter. Subscribing will get you case studies aimed at helping you in your media career, and it'll also support the work I do for this podcast. There are no ads on this podcast, so the only way to make it sustainable in the long run is to subscribe. Go to simonowens.substack.com. That's simonowens.substack.com. Or you can just Google the word Simon Owens and newsletter. Okay, on to my interview with Tyler. Hey, Tyler, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Simon.
So we're here to talk about a newsletter you launched a few years ago. But first, what were you doing prior to launching the newsletter?
Yeah, so in what I like to call my prior life, I was working in financial services consulting. So doing kind of the typical 12 to 15-hour days that a consultant gets used to. And now have switched to different types of 12 to 15-hour days.
So you were like working with companies in the financial sector, or you were doing things within their finance departments, or what kind of dynamic was that?
Yeah, so I was working mostly with financial services firms, so a lot of investment banks and commercial banks, and was doing some HR consulting. So a lot of looking into the practices that they use to, keep and, retain employees, how to attract employees, a lot of looking into compensation, 401ks, all of that good stuff. So a lot of things that, you've probably heard about in the news, especially around junior analysts, et cetera. The firm I was working with probably had something to do with some of that stuff.
So what got you thinking about launching a newsletter?
Yeah, so there were a couple of things. So it's a bit of a long story, I guess. So I'd been working in, financial services consulting for a little bit, or I guess about 10 years. So from post-college until just recently. But I had always been really interested in writing and the creative side. And so, I was a typical story, wanted to be a journalism major. My parents, kind of said, well, you're not going to make any money doing that. Why don't you be a finance major, right? Or a business major. So I went the finance route. It was fine. But I always had this interest in, in kind of getting my creative juices flowing. So a couple of years into my career in finance, I actually launched a website called entrylevel.com, which I guess the best way to explain it would be kind of a typical guy trying to create a Barstool knockoff or a Bro Bible knockoff. And so started writing about a lot of different things, sports, dating, all in kind of this irreverent and, and fun voice, and started to pick up a little bit of steam. At one point we had about 30 or 40 people contributing. We were getting in the tens of thousands of views per month. So not something that was going to be life-changing, but it was something I really enjoyed doing. And so started.
And this was while you were working 12-hour days as a financial
Correct,
consultant.
Yeah. So it was a little crazy, and that was part of the impetus for creating the newsletter. Is I started to realize after doing that for a couple of years, right? Like I wasn't making money off of it. I wasn't very good at figuring out SEO just because that wasn't my wheelhouse, and so started to see some of these newsletters popping up, like the Morning Brew. theSkimm was obviously very popular at this time. And I just thought about, why don't we send some of our blogs out via email newsletter? So we started doing some of that, and that started to get us some pretty good traction. I noticed that it was a lot easier to get people to read a blog if they were getting it into their email inbox every day, rather than trying to figure out how to get them to see it on Facebook or Twitter or something like that. So the reason
And back then, you were sending the newsletter. You were sending this newsletter. It was just an extension of your blog, which was writing about sports and other guy-related stuff.
yeah, basically. And so we started doing that, and we kind of said, well, this kind of has some legs, right? And as at the same time, I was writing a little bit more about kind of what was happening in my career, and just kind of funny stuff that was happening around the office. And that kind of started to turn into some stuff that we were writing, like these LinkedIn rebuttals that got somewhat popular. And then we started doing, some stuff about ridiculous things that were happening in the world of finance. And so all these things kind of came together all at once. And I think the biggest thing was I realized I wasn't going to be able to figure out how to make money off of this blog. And I figured, maybe we could give this a go with a newsletter. And so that's when we really shift focus, cut a bunch of the fat, said we're going to rename it. We're going to do, these kind of business news, professional advice type email newsletters, and go from there.
So you didn't have to start from scratch, and you kind of like you were writing this blog, and then you were able to use some of the traction there so that you could at least have like a little bit of a springboard when you were renaming this newsletter and relaunching it and stuff like that, so that you already had some existing subscribers and stuff like that, right?
Yeah, I mean, I would say from the subscriber base, I mean, it wasn't more than a couple hundred people on our mailing list, so it wasn't anything too helpful to start out with. But I would say is that we had a lot of practice, for a couple years before that, kind of perfecting our voice and getting the content right. So rather than figuring that out on the fly, we kind of already had that figured out when we launched the newsletter, which was pretty helpful because we went through a ton of different phases with the blog, and really kind of found what people liked with our voice.
And also you were kind of catching a trend because it really 10, 12 years ago, if you were launching a new media venture, it was a blog. It was like a Business Insider or some, TechCrunch or something like that. Whereas like the trend within the last like 5 to 10 years, you see a lot of it, a lot more focus on kind of like a newsletter. Like there might be still a web element, but it's a newsletter first type of leaning company. So you kind of leaned into that trend a little bit.
Absolutely. Yeah. I realized I was at the tail end of one trend and the beginning of another. So I guess I got lucky and jumped on the train.
So the new iteration of this newsletter was called the Water Coolest, and it had like a very kind of business focused background or business focused kind of beat. Were you trying to kind of, you mentioned Morning Brew, there's the hustle. Were you kind of trying to kind of create something very close to what they were doing?
Well, I mean, I will say we were definitely trying to create something in a different voice, but I think one of the biggest things is they kind of proved our hypothesis that something like this could work and work on a really big scale and be super successful. So that was one thing. So they were definitely, they definitely helped us kind of make the leap. But we had, a pretty different vision for what we wanted it to be, and a little bit more niche, especially, in our voice.
When you say more niche, so you said you have this background in financial services. Do you feel like that made you well equipped for this type of subject matter? Like, do you feel like you go a little bit deeper than maybe the Morning Brew, which I know that I'm not as familiar with the Morning Brew, but I know the hustle, like it has kind of like a very kind of top line, very conversational approach to business news. I was reading a few of your newsletters. It looks like sometimes it goes a little bit deeper. How do you feel about like how niche you were trying to go?
Yeah, so we definitely lean into, what I call our strengths, and where our audience lives. So I don't know if we kind of fell into it, if we got pretty lucky, but a lot of our audience is kind of analysts, associates working on Wall Street or, in finance, which is obviously a great thing, from an ad revenue perspective, et cetera. But we've certainly played into that, definitely going down those rabbit holes a little bit more. So whereas, the Morning Brew might cover, more broad economic topics, we would, dive in a little bit more to these, the nitty gritty of, a financial transaction, or, something that's, interesting that's happening in the finance world, especially considering, these the very, very interesting characters that are, in the finance world. We really like to discuss those, and that seems to be pretty popular among our audience.
So would you say someone working on Wall Street, they would find something like Morning Brew to be too broad for their level of expertise versus they might be more willing to subscribe to what you're doing?
Yeah, I mean, I would say, right. I think Morning Brew does a really great job of, and full disclosure, I read it every day, but I think it does a really great job of giving the high level, news. It does a really good of kind of summarizing it with bullet points, and making it super easy to read. Ours is a little bit different in that I would almost say it tends to be a little bit more blog like, right? And that probably has to do with, the history of how this company came to be, and that we're writing things that are a little bit longer, possibly a little bit more in depth. And I think people are coming to us to really see, kind of for us to read between the lines a little bit more, rather than just kind of getting the straight facts.
And talk to me, like, so there doesn't seem to be, like, I was looking at the website, there doesn't seem to be much of a web component to the newsletter. Like, I can only find issues on like this really kind of not super well optimized MailChimp.com type of link. It seems like you're very inbox focused, whereas like some other newsletters out there, they have a strong web component where they could have some SEO benefits and some social sharing benefits. Did you make a very conscious decision that you didn't really want this to be bloggy, like a blog at all? Like you wanted this to be like almost like this private club, like it had to be landing in people's inboxes?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's partially, just because we're such a small company. So it's myself, and three other guys who are helping out mostly on the content side. So from a perspective of running a blog and a newsletter, that might be a little tough. But I would say one of the things that we consciously thought about and always think about is we really want to be getting into people's inboxes, because our ad revenue comes from the newsletter, right? So we want to make sure that, quite frankly, that you're not getting our content unless you're signing up for our newsletter, right? Because that's how we keep the lights on. And so that was one of the things that we didn't want to put everything out there, necessarily on the internet so people could read it, but that they have to kind of go through the inbox route.
Is there a trade-off there? Because like I said, you don't get any SEO benefits out of that. You don't. It might be harder for people to share what you're doing on social media, so there's less viral effect. Do you feel like you're making any trade-offs by not making like a good web version of the newsletter?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely do. I mean, there's trade-offs to everything, and I think that's kind of the cool thing about us, being so small and being pretty agile, is I think that could certainly change in the future as we continue to grow and think about ways to one, get the word out there. And I think one of the things you mentioned is, you hit on, that was is certainly important to us, is being able to share our content. And we've been thinking through different ways of how we want to do that. Whether it's kind of having each link be able to be shared, across social or whatever it may be, or even doing some stuff directly on social so people can get at least a taste of our content, especially on Instagram or one of the other platforms that we have a decent sized presence on.
So talk to me about growth. Like, how did you find initial readers? If there wasn't a strong web component, there's basically just a landing page for the website where people can sign up. How were you driving those? How did you go from a few hundred subscribers to, I think you have a couple tens of thousands of them now?
Yeah. So one of the biggest things we did, was we worked with a lot of Instagram influencers kind of right off the bat. And I think it was a bit of luck and a bit of timing. So I'm not sure how familiar you are with it, but there's a pretty big kind of financial meme community, which is, comprised mostly of, people who are, trading pretty regularly or or working on Wall Street. And there's a ton of these. I would say probably about a year and a half or maybe 2 years ago, these accounts really started taking off, and I kind of started to notice them, right around the time that we were really starting to focus on growth and had some money to start reinvesting into the company. And so I reached out to a lot of these guys, and they were really great and helpful about getting the word out about us, for quite frankly pretty cheap compared to what you'd be getting subscribers for on Facebook, or if you're paying Instagram. So that really helped us. And then from there, a lot of those people, it was one of those things where we built out a sharing referral program, and even just sending the email around. A lot of people in their offices were sending it around. And so once we kind of had that hook, I guess you could say, we had a lot of people doing hearing about it through word of mouth, quite frankly.
So these were Instagram accounts that are sharing like jokes using insider jargon and stuff like that on Instagram. You'd reach out to them, say, how much does it cost to do a sponsored post? They would do one, and then it would be something like, see the link in our profile or whatever.
Exactly. Yeah. So a lot of them were doing the swipe ups, and I mean, at the beginning, because now a lot of them, if you find some of them, there's Finance God and Not Your Father's Broker and Liquidity, right? You'll see that they're all working with pretty big brands, doing ads, and we got, I guess, pretty lucky to get in with them. I think before they realized how valuable their presence was, because they had crazy good engagement. I mean, there were days that we were getting high quality leads, for 10 cents a pop. So it was really great timing, and really helped us establish this great audience kind of in the financial services community, which has been really great.
Walk me through the process of compiling each day's newsletter.
Yeah. So that's funny. That's kind of a question we get a lot. But it's a lot of it starts kind of in the morning. So typically we'll start doing our review for the next day's newsletter pretty much as soon as markets open, and taking a look at just what the big headlines are. We kind of have our roster of blogs that we're reading, newsletters that we're reading in the morning, and then obviously the Wall Street Journal, CNBC's, Bloomberg's that we're following pretty regularly. And then I would say probably one of the bigger things that helps me at least kind of figure out what people want to be, or talking about, right? Because the idea behind, our newsletter is like the water cooler, right? So what people are talking about around the water cooler the next day. So, hey, did you see XYZ news, that sort of thing. So I'm pretty much throughout the day, I'm looking at Twitter, Reddit, so, Wall Street Bets, stock market, Reddit, Instagram, to see really what people are talking about and what they're picking up on, because those tend to be, the kind of biggest stories that people, hone in on. Because what we've realized is, just because, there might be, an equity offering, or, a company goes public, and it's worth billions of dollars, it might not be the most interesting story of the day, right? It might be something that Elon Musk said on Twitter, that we can get a whole piece out of, because it's so interesting and affects all these different parts of of Tesla and SpaceX and investors. So there's a lot of kind of high level stuff. So looking at what are the CNBC's, Wall Street Journals of the world talking about, but then really diving into the more forum based stuff. And seeing what are people talking about, and what is more precisely our demographic talking about.
And when are you sending it out?
So it goes out every morning at 6 a.m.
And how much is your own personal brand tied into it? Like, if I were to say the name Tyler to someone who opens your emails every day, would they know who I'm talking about? Would they have a sense of who you are as a person?
So that's something that we have tried to develop from the beginning. So that's one big differentiator, I would say, that we have from the hustle, the Morning Brew, right? So I know the Morning Brew, at the very least, they say at the bottom, written by, these three people. So something we've always tried to do, and one of readers, favorite things in the newsletter is our water cooler talking points. So they tend to be, these kind of wrap ups at the end of each piece. That's kind of jokey, kind of. It started out basically as something that you could say to someone around the water cooler, and it was actually a pretty intelligent thought at the beginning. If you go back to the first days of our newsletter, and it kind of devolved into this thing where it's kind of this joke or this really kind of irreverent remark about what's going on, and so people have come to really love that. And what we do is we actually put which of the writers said that, so that's kind of helped develop a little bit of an understanding of of who's saying what and how we actually feel about it. And I get the question a lot. There's myself, and then there's AJ, Nick, and Ian, and everyone always asks, like, are those real people or is it just you? And no, those are actual real people who are helping write the newsletter every day, and those are their actual real thoughts. Like, a lot of that stuff we just lift from our Slack channel, because we're basically eating and breathing this stuff all day. So, we're just talking about it, joking about it. And then it ends up in the newsletter. And I think that gives it another little personal touch. And that's something that we lifted from Barstool, which we really love about Barstool is, they've built this brand around, Big Cat and KFC and Dave. And so, we wanted to get a little element of that into our newsletter. So, you kind of come back to see, well, what did Tyler say? What did Ian say about, this story today?
What kind of interactivity do you have with your readership? Like, how often are your readers responding? What are they responding with? Do you incorporate any of that conversation into the newsletter itself?
Yeah, so we certainly want to be doing more of that. So I'd say, unfortunately, right now, most of our interactivity is typically people telling us that there was a spelling error, quite frankly. But we do get some stuff, some feedback on stories. Obviously, every once in a while, we get kind of the crazy political person who gets angry about a reference we made or something we called somebody. So we get that every once in a while. But I think it's that's definitely an important next step for us, and that's actually something that we're building out with this premium product that we've been working on, which I'm sure we'll touch on. But that's something that the community aspect is certainly important. And one thing that we want to do, going back to those water cooler talking points, is have the community be submitting talking points that will get into the newsletter. So if Joe Schmo has a take on something that Elon Musk did, or Amazon stock, right? They can shoot that over to us, or submit it, and if we approve it, it looks good, we can include it in there. And I think it's just another cool little aspect to get people involved. And the way we've kind of been thinking about it internally is almost similar to what theSkimm does with with their birthdays, right? It's a little shout out, but it also gets the audience involved a little bit more. And it's always cool to see your name in something that is going out to quite a few people.
Yeah, it's something I'm trying to do with my own newsletter, where someone does respond with something thoughtful, trying to use that as a writing prompt so that I can like quote them within the next issue of the newsletter, and then respond to what they say, and then you have almost kind of like a jumping off point for a brand new article or something like that. So it can be cool when you can incorporate that in. What's your social media strategy? Because I saw that you're fairly active on Instagram and Twitter, but obviously there's not a huge web component to your newsletter. What do you think about like social media as a way to build your business or your audience?
Yeah. So, again, I think it comes down to, we're still a relatively small fish, right? So we don't have a full social media team. So we do post on Instagram fairly regularly. A lot of it, again, is kind of going in on our strengths, which, I think is our voice, and especially kind of those quotes that we have. So a lot of, in talking about the water cooler talking points. So what we'll do typically on Instagram is kind of link to, or excuse me, kind of create a post around, one of those, one of those water cooler talking points, and then give a little blurb from the newsletter just so people get some context around, what it means. And those have seemed to do, pretty well, and at least get people interested in, what we're doing and how we're doing it, and they get a really better, a much better understanding of what they're going to get, once they get into the newsletter.
Are you trying to do anything in terms of like having different sign up forms for different people and trying to do segmented list, or is this basically just it goes everybody signs up coming from whatever direction, like they're all going into the same list and receiving the exact same newsletter?
Yeah, so right now everybody gets the exact same newsletter. I think in the future that could be something that we think about, especially as we look to different kind of business models. Especially thinking of something like, I love what the Brew is doing. I think they're launching a new marketing one, and they have like emerging tech, and I think something like that is really interesting to broaden your horizons. And as we think about it, there's certainly some angles we can play up there, especially, considering our audience, is pretty deep and, in the finance space. So that's something that, I think more broadly, we would certainly be looking to, segment our audience a little bit.
I feel like there were a lot of newsletters like this out there where, it tries to summarize that day's news and be kind of like a one-stop shop. We've mentioned a couple of them so far. There were a lot of blogs like this like 15 years ago. Like if you look at early days of Gawker, it was very little original reporting. It was mainly just kind of snarky curation of the news. Same thing with early days of Business Insider. The market eventually got kind of saturated. Do you think there's a limit to the potential growth when you're not producing a lot of original reporting and it's just commentary like what you're doing?
Yeah, I mean, I admittedly, yes, I think there is, right? Because people are certainly interested in kind of the breaking news and seeing what's new. But I think there are plenty of examples. I guess Gawker isn't the best example, but kind of thinking about the bar stools.
I mean, that became a thriving media company, and obviously because the one lawsuit
Right,
took them
right.
down, but it was doing pretty well
Right,
for a
right.
while
Yeah,
there.
I mean, I think there's certainly examples of the success that people want to hear this, and I think the thing is, right, if you can kind of build out that voice, I always think about it as as our voice and kind of our commentary as the moat we're building around our audience, right? Because in theory, they can go get news tidbits. Like, we're never going to be able to compete with the Wall Street Journal, with Bloomberg, etc., and everyone can get their news from there. But what we hope for and what we're looking to build is something that people can't live without, because they're entertained by it and it becomes part of their daily routine, that they really want to see what does the water coolest have to say about this certain event. So I definitely think that there's some potential downside to how big it could be, but I think where we're able to make up for that is how engrossed the audience is, and how fervent they are about what we're putting out.
So there isn't some business plan or phase two somewhere, in a spreadsheet on your computer about hiring reporters and doing original content and stuff like that.
So they're not necessarily original content. I think there definitely is, a look into doing deeper dives, right? So, I could certainly see us doing, kind of deeper dives on companies. So hiring possibly more folks coming out of the finance space who have a better understanding, but also, are able to write in our voice on more specific subjects that maybe myself and some of the other guys writing currently, we'd probably be considered more generalists. So definitely kind of deep diving into or diving deep into some more of those subjects.
Talk to me about monetization. So first, how do you sell ads in the newsletter?
Yeah, so we go about that a couple different ways. So we first of all, we work with a couple of different companies who are helping us sell them. So I guess ad networks, you call them. So we typically only like to work on a flat fee basis. That's kind of the goal, right? But we've expanded. We do some stuff kind of in the affiliate type thing. Some stuff we work on commission, especially where we know that a brand is going to sell really well to our audience. So I would say, it's a lot of kind of working with, with those companies who are, helping us sell the brands. Then some of it, a smaller percentage, I would say, is kind of us reaching out directly to brands who we think, would be a good fit. That's obviously a little bit hit or miss because, one, you have to find the contact. Two, they have to be interested in, in advertising and newsletters. So it's, that's kind of a numbers game. And then three, we obviously have some inbound folks coming to us and saying, hey, I love what you're doing. I think, my company would be a great fit. Can can we run some ads? And so that stuff, unfortunately, as you probably know, has dried up quite a bit in the recent months, just with everything that's going on. So we've been much more focused on, doing our own reach out, kind of tapping the folks who we've had a lot of success with, and really thinking about, how can we help them on pricing, or how can we get in different types of ads. So we've been trying to get a little bit more creative, just like every other company who's trying to survive this.
And is it a lot of direct response advertisers? Like, is it the hope that someone will click through on that ad and make an immediate or quickly make a purchase, that type of thing?
Yeah, and I say it, kind of unfortunately, right? Because there's a lot of the conversations, I have to have, with folks is how much awareness, we're bringing to a brand, right? So it's much more passive when somebody, goes by your ad on Facebook or Instagram, right? Just kind of scrolling. Whereas you have, two dedicated spots. So you have a header placement, and a native placement in our newsletter. And, we have super highly engaged, readers. So unfortunately, sometimes it doesn't always translate into a ton of direct sales. So, that makes for some crappy conversations to have. But that's definitely where we see most of our ad revenue coming from, is companies in that space who are, trying out the newsletter route. And most of them are fairly open to, to the flat fee, but a lot of conversations we have too are, around, can we try commission, can we try kind of a mixed approach, that sort of thing.
You said it started with like a very kind of broy voice. Do you feel like it's still very broy and it's very kind of male centric to this day?
So I don't love the love broy. I know we get called that a lot. I mean, people have compared us to, kind of the barstool voice. But I like to think that, we're irreverent and humorous versus kind of broy. But I would say, yes, we do stick to that voice, because it's done really well for us. But obviously, it's super important for us to be inclusive. So I think that's where, broy, I think there can be some negative connotations there, and we certainly at all costs try to avoid that, and want to be funny, but open to have everybody read and everyone get a kick out of what we're writing.
You mentioned a paid membership program. Has that launched yet, and what is in it?
So yeah, so it has not launched. So full disclosure, my wife is actually due, with our first kid in the next like 24 hours. So I have, so
Wow.
I've had a quite a bit on my plate. So we pushed that back until after the birth. But I know I mentioned it to you before. So it's called the C Suite, and it is something that came out of, this recent, downturn. We started thinking about ways that we can diversify, our revenue streams. And one of the ways, we kept getting feedback. I guess going back to your feedback question, we kept getting feedback from people of, where can I get more, water coolest? How can I get more? People kept asking us, about blogs, about podcasts, and quite frankly, we just didn't have the bandwidth to launch that. But we started to really kind of look internally and see if we could, get the resources to be able to do that. And so we started coming up with the idea for the C Suite, which is, our paid premium subscription model. So the weekday newsletter is always going to be free. That's how we always want to be able to drive users and get people interested in our brand. And then for those people who are interested in something extra, we're launching the C-suite probably the second week of July, and that's going to include a members only Sunday newsletter, some exclusive blog content. There's going to be a community aspect to that, and then it'll be totally ad free. So even in your weekday newsletter, you won't have to see any of the ads. We're hoping that folks will be interested in that. And we've gotten a lot of positive feedback. With some of the surveys we've done about if people are willing to pay for these kind of value ads, and so we're really excited to launch that in the next couple of weeks.
Yeah, I mean, there's an interesting debate about like paid newsletters and what should the paid version be. And I've seen some pushback saying it shouldn't just be more of what you're already producing for free, because people are usually fine with whatever they're receiving. Like, how do you create a different kind of value add? This is something I'm definitely doing with my newsletter, where I just launched kind of like a case study series for paying subscribers, where I could like go in,
Yep.
I do like an in-depth interview with a content creator and go deep on something like that. So it's something that I've struggled with. What about you? Like, so like it sounds like, so it's an extra Sunday newsletter, so it is a little bit more of the same, ad free, which obviously that's a component definitely there, where it's a little bit of a value add. You said there's a community aspect. I see a lot of content creators experimenting with this, where it has the benefit, it provides like a real benefit to the subscriber, because they get to network and converse with other people within their industry, but it's also somewhat of a benefit to the content creator, because it gives them a little slack, so they're not having to produce 100% of the content. Like, the community starts helping to produce some of the content, and it becomes kind of self-sustaining. What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, so one of the big things is, on our Sunday newsletter, I 100% agree with you, right? We didn't want to just create a sixth email, right? That's just talking about the same stuff that we talk about every day. So one of the things that we're really focusing on, and I think to an extent, everything that's been happening over the past, what is it, 3-4 months now, is we really want to do more forward-looking news, right? So insights into what you can expect, and things that are coming down the pipeline. So I know a lot of other newsletters will say, what's happening in the economic calendar, what earnings are coming down the pipeline, and we'll certainly have that. But I think one of the biggest things that we want to look for is, like, what are the biggest 3 or 4 headlines that you can expect next week, and not only what you can expect, but what you can expect from them, right? So you can actually make some pretty actionable decisions on them, whether it's an investing decision, or some sort of or just knowing it, right, for your next meeting, or being able to talk about it intelligently at the around the water cooler. Because we know that our current newsletter, and a lot of the newsletters that are out there, are really backward looking, and so we really want to focus on the forward looking aspect of it, to really talk about, like, the big ideas that are shaping the business world going forward. And then, as far as the community access, 100% agree with you there. I think there's definitely 2 aspects there. Is one, our audience is made up of a lot of folks who are kind of the analyst associate level, but we also have at least a nice little percentage who kind of are at the upper level of finance. So I think being able to give folks access to both of those people, whether you're a college student looking to to network with an analyst or associate to see how to break into the industry, or someone a little bit more senior, looking to connect with someone that maybe you wouldn't be able to connect with otherwise. That's something that's important. And then the other thing, kind of going back to what we talked about before, is those water cooler talking points and some other aspects, is really having the audience help us with content, and not only just creating content or creating these talking points, but really driving what we're talking about. As I mentioned, I'm always on Reddit, on Twitter, trying to figure out what our audience is talking about. But, if I have literally, hundreds of people, in our actual audience who are reading our newsletter every day, talking about a certain topic, it'll certainly give me a leg up on what we should be writing about.
And what do you plan to charge for the membership?
Yeah, so we are going to be charging $7 a month, and it's going to be discounted to $5 for the first month that we have it going, and then we'll be doing $5 promotions probably pretty regularly, which is one of the reasons we started with the $7. If we said, we kind of went back and forth on it, and I actually believe it was on one of your podcasts that I was listening to that someone mentioned you should always charge a little bit more than you're comfortable with, and I really like that idea, just because realistically, I think if someone really enjoys our content and wants to kind of help us out and support us, I think the difference between $2, $5 and $7 isn't huge for them, but thinking from our scale, that could certainly move the needle. So that was one of the big things that when we were thinking about price sensitivity, we took into account.
Do you have any plans to expand beyond newsletters? Like I could see like a daily podcast that does much of the same function as what you're doing with the newsletter, where it kind of catches people up on what they need to know. Obviously, those daily podcasts that kind of do this kind of function are becoming a big thing now. Do you have any? What are your thoughts, or do you just want to stay 100% focused on newsletters?
No, so we actually did have, we do want to go into podcasting. We actually did have a podcast. So when we first started, I think maybe like a month or two after we started, we started doing a podcast that was basically like a 1 to 2 minute rundown of what we were talking about. So I think it works really well because our voice is so conversational. So it lends itself really well to like quick kind of witty podcast. And so we were sending that for a little while. And then we kind of halted it just because it wasn't, super professionally, produced. So we want to really make sure that we were giving a good go at it and that we'd be able to monetize it correctly. So that is something that's, in the pipeline, and it actually may end up being a part of the C-suite. That's one of the things that, in our surveying of folks, that a lot of people were interested in. The blog and Sunday newsletter happened to be a little bit more popular, so that might be something that we add to that later on, or that we kind of put in front of the paywall so that we can go ahead and use that as another way to drive folks to the newsletter. So to answer your question, yeah, we definitely want to get into podcasts, and I think our our voice and kind of our niche really lends itself to it.
Okay, Tyler. Well, those are all the questions I had for you. Where can people find you online?
Yeah, so you can sign up for the newsletter at thewatercoolest.com. And once you're a member of that, we will be launching the C-suite in a couple of weeks. So if you're interested in that, you can keep an eye out in the newsletter.
Okay, this is a lot of fun. Thanks so much for joining me.
Thanks a lot, Simon. I appreciate it.
Okay, thanks for joining us. I'm actually on the lookout for new guests for this podcast. So if you do interesting stuff in digital content, whether you're a full-time YouTuber, a media executive, or run a cool niche newsletter, definitely reach out. My email address is simonowens@gmail.com. Okay, see you next week.